Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section, we're going to look at one of the newer features in Excel 2019, and this follows on really nicely from our sections looking at forecasting, because the new feature is what's called one-click forecasting. Now, it's not really one-click forecasting. It does take a few clicks, but it is pretty impressive, fairly straightforward facility for forecasting time-based data. And what I'm going to do in this section is give you a run through of a very straightforward example and also refer you to the help section, which runs through the main features of this one-click forecasting. Now, first of all, let me just emphasize the point that this is intended for time-based data. And in theory, the dates for the data you can see in column B there in the sample I'm going to use. The dates should be evenly spaced. So I have January the 1st, February the 1st, etc. And these are sales figures. And for each date there are, so for instance for February the 1st, 2015, the sales figure in column C is the total of the sales for the preceding month. So you can see that over time, sales for this particular company are increasing. Now, this is typical of the sort of data we were using earlier on for doing forecasting, but with one-click forecasting, you can get an awful lot of information for a very small amount of effort. Now, I talked just now about these dates being evenly spaced. These are spaced out month by month. You can actually have gaps in the data. They need to be fundamentally evenly spaced, but you could have a month or two figures missing. In fact, you can have up to 30% of the data points missing, and this will still generally do a pretty decent job. So let's do a run through now of one-click forecasting with that data. Note the last month I've got there is June the 1st, 2016. Let's aim to forecast sales up until the end of August. So we're looking at the sales figures on September the 1st, 2016. First of all, let me select the data. And now on the Data tab, in the Forecast group, there is a Forecast Sheet option. And that brings up a dialog, the Create Forecast Worksheet dialog. Now you have a couple of basic choices to make here. If you want to see a line graph or a column chart, and basically if you look at the column chart first, the blue columns indicate the actual data and the orange columns indicate the forecast values. You can probably just about make out the little vertical lines through the top of each column, which indicate the range in which the forecast might fall. And in fact, if I go back to the line graph, you can see this sort of funnel effect there, the lower and upper thinner lines here representing the lower confidence bound and the upper confidence bound for the sales. Now, I just said I'm going to forecast up until September the 1st, so I'm going to set the end date for the forecast just here. And then I also have a number of other options. Let's take a look at those other options. So I've already set the forecast end date. I can also set the forecast start date. By default, it's using the final date in my actual historical data. And it is well worth reading the notes in that help page I referred you to on forecast. Refer to the forecast start date, as there can be some advantages to setting a start date before the end of the historical data. And then you can see how well those predictions match your actual measurements, and they should match them very well. Having said that, obviously, if that reduces the number of historical data points that you've got, then it may in turn harm the prediction. So it's a matter of achieving a balance. The confidence interval is next. You can switch this off, and if you look at the line graph while I do that, there's now no confidence interval. Now, what that confidence interval means is that in this context, 95% of predicted values will fall within that funnel. If you reduce the percentage, you would find that that band would get narrower and narrower, and with a narrower band to aim at, less values would fall within the predicted range. The next important option is seasonality. If you're dealing with seasonal data, then you can either tell Excel 2019 to detect seasonality, or you can set it manually. Now, what we mean by seasonality, for example, is if we're dealing with monthly data and over the course of a year there tends to be a monthly pattern, then we would consider our cycle in this case to be a year and the number of intervals in that cycle to be 12. So we would manually set a value of 12 for seasonality. On the other hand, on a yearly sales cycle, if you believe that you basically follow the 4 seasons of the year, you might set that value manually to 4 instead. Generally speaking, when it comes to detecting seasonality, you really need 2 complete cycles for that to work successfully. Obviously, in this case, we only have 18 months worth of data, so its ability to detect seasonality is going to be severely restricted. Finally, on the left-hand side of the options, we have Include Forecast Statistics. If you check this box, in the resulting forecast worksheet, you'll have a lot of very technically advanced statistics. So again, if you're not a statistician and you're not particularly keen on dealing with things like exponential smoothing algorithms, then you might want to bypass the forecast statistics. But if you are interested, check that box and you'll get some very interesting statistics on the forecast worksheet as well. On the right-hand side of the options, you have the timeline range and the values range, and then again, 2 more important options. If you have missing points, you can either ask Excel to interpolate those values. So if you say had a month's worth missing, it would look at the values either side of the missing month and work out its best guess. Or you can replace them by zeros. Now, obviously, in the case of our sales, replacing with zeros would pretty much confuse things, but there are situations where you're measuring over time where replacing a value with 0 might be more appropriate. And then finally, you can, in certain situations, have multiple readings on the same date. And this may, for example, happen in meteorology when you are taking measurements of rainfall in different sources. In that case, where you have multiple values for the same date, you can average the values. Average is the default, or you could process them in any of these ways. For example, you could use the max or the medium or the sum. We'll stick with the default, which is average. And there we are. As I mentioned before, you couldn't really call it one-click forecasting, but it didn't involve too many clicks, and you get not only that nice graph, but you get a table showing the historical data and the predicted values. Note the first forecast is June the 1st, which is also my last historical point. And you have the values in the lower confidence bound and the upper confidence bound as well. Note that the contents of this sheet can also be formatted in the normal way. So if I wanted to do some work on the chart, I could select it and do all the normal kinds of formatting. So that's it on one-click forecasting. We just have one more section now on statistical functions, and that's statistical functions for inference. Please join me in the next section for that.